The fire had been burning since 3 o'clock. Not the roaring, ambitious kind of fire that announces itself to a room, but the steady, patient kind, the sort that has long since decided it will be here for the evening, and sees no reason to make a fuss about it. The coals had settled into that particular shade of deep amber that belongs only to late afternoon in autumn, when the light outside is already giving up on the day, and the warmth inside becomes something one notices, the way you notice breathing when you are very still. Dr. John Watson sat in the armchair to the left of the hearth, his armchair, as any visitor to 221B Baker Street quickly understood, for Holmes's chair was the other one, the one with the slightly worn armrest on the right side and a faint smell of Turkish tobacco that no amount of Mrs. Hudson's airing out had ever fully persuaded to leave. Watson had a newspaper across his lap, opened to a column about parliamentary procedure that he was, in all honesty, not reading. He was doing what the best armchairs invite a person to do on grey October afternoons. He was simply being warm. The room breathed around him. That is perhaps the only way to describe 221B at its quietest. It breathed. The curtains shifted a half-inch when a cab clattered past on Baker Street below. The fire gave a small, contented pop and sent a single curl of orange light dancing briefly up the chimney. Somewhere, on the mantelpiece, between the tobacco pouch and the unanswered correspondence that Holmes skewered to the wood with a jackknife he had absolutely no practical use for, a clock ticked with the easy rhythm of something that had been ticking in this room for so long it had become part of the silence, rather than an interruption of it. Rain was beginning outside, not yet committed to it, still making the kind of tentative half-hearted attempt that London rain often makes in October, as though testing whether the city is in the mood. Thin drops tapped at the window glass, paused, tapped again. The gas lamp on the street below had already been lit, and its glow came up through the curtains in a soft, diffused gold that fell across the rug and made the room feel amber all the way to its edges. Holmes was at his desk, or rather, Holmes was doing what he called being at his desk, which looked from the outside almost entirely unlike work, but which Watson had learned over several years of close observation, occasionally produced results of some brilliance. He was reclined back in his chair at an angle that would have alarmed a furniture maker, one leg draped over the armrest, a large chemistry text open in his lap, at a page concerning the molecular properties of arsenic compounds that he had been staring at, or through, for the better part of an hour. His violin was propped within arm's reach. He had not played it yet this afternoon, but it was there the way a pen is there beside someone who is thinking about writing, present, patient, full of intention. "The rain," Holmes said without looking up, "will not commit to itself before 6 o'clock. Watson turned a page of his newspaper with great dignity. "I didn't ask." "No, but you were thinking about it. You've looked at the window 3 times in the past 11 minutes, and each time your expression suggested mild inconvenience rather than concern, from which I deduce you had no plans this evening that depended on dry weather, but that you were perhaps hoping for the cosier excuse of a storm to justify not making any." Watson set the newspaper down. "Is it possible," he said pleasantly, "for you to sit in a room with another person without narrating their interior life?" Holmes turned a page of the chemistry text. "Possible? Certainly. Interesting? Rarely. This was, Watson reflected, a fairly representative sample of a quiet Tuesday afternoon at Baker Street. The detective had been between cases for 9 days, not restless yet, not in the way that produced violin concertos at 2 a.m. or chemistry experiments that smelled of burning rubber, but in the preliminary stage that Watson had come to recognize as the one where Holmes turned his considerable analytical attention onto whatever happened to be nearby. Watson had been the nearest thing nearby for 9 days. His newspaper reading habits, his bootlace preferences, and the particular rhythm of his sighing had all been, at various points, the subject of brief but penetrating commentary. It was, Watson thought, rather like being observed by a very intelligent cat. Still, it was warm. The fire was settled. The rain was beginning, in its tentative way, and from somewhere below came the sound of Mrs. Hudson moving through her kitchen, the particular cadence of her footsteps against the flagstone floor. 3 steps, a pause, a draw, a pause, the clink of something ceramic set down with the care of someone who has always treated crockery as worthy of respect. The smell of something baking had been drifting upstairs since 4 o'clock, something sweet and faintly spiced, cinnamon perhaps, or the gentle warmth of a nutmeg grating. Watson's newspaper held considerably less interest than that smell. "She's made lardy cake," Holmes said. I had arrived at the same conclusion. "No, you'd arrived at something sweet," I specified. Watson considered arguing. Then he considered lardy cake. "Fine," he said. "You specified." The clock on the mantelpiece ticked. The rain tapped. The coals shifted with a sound like a quiet word in a different language. It was, Watson would later think, looking back across the small, unhurried geography of that afternoon, one of those hours that don't announce their importance at the time, the kind that sit in memory not because anything dramatic occurred, but because they contained, somewhere inside them, the last moments of things being entirely ordinary. He didn't know that yet, of course. He was reading about parliamentary procedure, mostly not reading it, listening to the rain, thinking about lardy cake, existing in the amber warmth of 221B on an October afternoon, with the comfortable and entirely accurate sense that nothing particularly required him at this moment. And then Mrs. Hudson's footsteps changed. It was a small thing, a very small thing, the sort of thing that Watson, before his years of living alongside Sherlock Holmes, would not have noticed at all, and that even now he almost didn't. But the rhythm of her movement downstairs had shifted from the easy domestic 3-step pause step of someone following the comfortable path of afternoon preparations into something different, a slowing, a hesitation, and then the particular silence of someone who has stopped moving altogether and is listening. Watson lowered his newspaper. Holmes's page did not turn. Below, the silence continued for perhaps 5 seconds. Then, clearly, carried up through the old house's bones, in the way sounds always travel through buildings that have been standing long enough to know all the acoustic paths, came the sound of the front door being opened, not knocked upon first, opened, as though whoever had come to it had stood there for some time before deciding, or finally finding the courage to knock at all. The knock, when it came, was soft, not tentative in the way of someone who doesn't wish to disturb, but careful, in the way of someone who is not certain of their welcome, and would prefer, if unwelcome, to be turned away quietly rather than loudly. Holmes set down his chemistry text. He did not sit up. He simply turned his head very slightly toward the ceiling, which was the direction that sound from the front door was not actually coming from, but which was, Watson had observed, the direction Holmes looked when he was no longer not listening. Downstairs, the front door was opened properly, and Mrs. Hudson's voice drifted up. Not her words, just the tone of her voice. And the tone was not the one she used for clients. Clients received a particular measured warmth, efficient and pleasant, the greeting of a woman who has ushered dozens of distressed strangers into a waiting room and knows precisely how much comfort to offer without encouraging delay. This was different. This was slower, more careful. The voice of someone choosing words with some consideration. Watson and Holmes looked at each other. Holmes said nothing. But he put the violin within arm's reach, which was what Holmes did when he was paying attention to something he hadn't decided what to do with yet. The voices below murmured for a moment, Mrs. Hudson's and another, quieter one, barely audible from upstairs. Then footsteps, not toward the stairs, as a client would be guided, but sideways, deeper into the ground floor. Toward Mrs. Hudson's own parlour, at the back of the house, the small room she kept for herself, and rarely opened to the upstairs tenants or their varied parade of callers. Watson set his newspaper down entirely. "She's taken them to her own sitting room," he said, quietly. Holmes was already standing. He had risen from his chair with the particular silent efficiency he reserved for moments of interest. Not urgency, not alarm, but that precise quality of heightened attention that manifested physically as a kind of gathering, as though all of him that had been scattered across the afternoon suddenly drew itself together into a single, alert point. He crossed to the door of their sitting room and opened it a few inches, not wide enough to be seen from below if someone happened to look up the stairs, but wide enough for sound to travel more clearly. Watson came to stand beside him. From below, the soft closing of a door. Then silence. Not the ordinary silence of an empty house, but the fuller, somehow denser silence of a house where something is happening in a room you cannot see. Holmes stood very still for a moment. Then he quietly closed their own door and turned back to the room. "Interesting," he said, and it was not the word he used when something was mildly curious. It was the word he used when a small fact had appeared that did not belong in the arrangement of other small facts he had been quietly accumulating without realizing he was doing so. Watson looked at him. "You know something. I suspect something, which is a different matter and considerably more honest." Holmes moved to the window, not to look out, but to lean against the wall beside it in his thinking posture, arms folded, gaze focused on the middle distance. "Mrs. Hudson, in 9 years, has never once taken a visitor to her own sitting room without at minimum offering them first to us. Perhaps this visitor isn't our sort. All visitors are our sort eventually. That is, rather, the nature of Baker Street." Holmes's eyes moved thoughtfully. No, she made a decision at the door. She saw who was there, and she made quickly a private decision. That is not the Mrs. Hudson of professional habit. That is the Mrs. Hudson of personal history. Watson considered this. Outside, the rain had made up its mind at last, and was now properly, committedly falling. The kind of October rain that darkens the stone of every building it touches and fills the gutters with a steady, purposeful rush. The gas lamp outside threw its gold up through the wet glass in shifting, liquid patterns across the ceiling. The fire gave another small, comfortable pop. Watson moved back to his armchair and sat down. After a moment, Holmes returned to his own chair, but didn't pick up the chemistry text. He sat instead in a posture Watson recognized, back straight, fingers laced loosely in his lap, attention turned quietly inward. The posture not of a man at rest, but of a man filing things away, building a structure of small observations into something he would, in time, know what to do with. They did not speak for several minutes. The clock ticked. The rain fell. The lardy cake smell drifted upward, a little fainter now, having been somewhat crowded out by the coal smoke and the coming dark. Then Watson said, "She was expecting her." Holmes turned his head. "Oh." Her footsteps changed before the knock. She heard her coming, or heard something that meant someone was coming. She was already listening before the door sounded. Watson paused. She was waiting for her. Holmes looked at him for a long moment, the particular look he reserved for occasions when Watson arrived somewhere unexpected, under his own power. And there was in it something that was not quite surprise, and not quite approval, but sat quietly in the warm territory between the two. "Yes," Holmes said, "that is also what I thought." Outside, Baker Street received the rain with its usual long patience. The hansom cab slowed. The lamplight spread in widening gold circles on the wet stones. The newspaper sellers under the corner awning shuffled closer together. The city was settling into its evening self, the loud daytime city pulling its coat across its shoulders and becoming something slower and more interior. And at 221B, in the small sitting room at the back of the house, the one with the blue curtains that Watson had only been inside twice, and which smelled of lavender and old paper and the particular kind of quiet that belongs to a woman who has made her own peace with a great many things, something was beginning. Something that had, Watson suspected, already been a long time in the beginning. He picked up his newspaper again. Holmes reached, without looking, for his violin, drew the bow across the strings once, softly, as though asking a question. The note hung in the room for a moment, warm and wondering. The rain fell. The fire settled. The clock kept its patient count. The violin did not play that evening. Holmes had drawn the bow across the strings once, as though asking a question of the room, and then had set it down again, propped against the chair leg with the careful placement of something that would be returned to, but not yet. Watson noticed. He said nothing. When Holmes put down the violin without playing, it was either because he had found something more interesting to listen to, or because the quality of the silence required preservation. Tonight, Watson suspected it was both. The rain had committed itself fully now. It fell with purpose against the windows of Baker Street, drawing long grey lines down the glass and filling the room with that particular acoustic quality that heavy rain gives to enclosed spaces, a kind of softening, as though the world outside has been very gently padded with wool. The fire responded to it in the way fires do, burning a shade brighter and more deliberately, as though aware it was the only warm, dry thing for some distance in every direction, and taking its responsibilities seriously. Watson turned the pages of his newspaper without reading them. Holmes sat in his thinking posture, loose-limbed and apparently absent, but Watson could see, had long learned to see, the small signs of active attention, The very slight tension at the corner of his jaw, the way his eyes moved periodically to the door and back, the manner in which he was breathing a fraction more slowly and deliberately than he did when genuinely at rest. Holmes, at rest, was a large, comfortable, somewhat dishevelled presence in a room. Holmes' thinking was something else, a kind of controlled stillness, like a compass needle that has found its bearing and is waiting. Below them, the parlour stayed quiet. This was, in itself, information. Watson had been in enough rooms where difficult conversations happened to know that this kind was not the quiet of two people sitting in easy companionship. That silence had a different texture, more relaxed, punctuated by the small sounds of tea being poured and biscuits being lifted, and the occasional satisfied settling of cushions. This quiet was deliberate. This was the quiet of word being chosen with great care, of things being said that had waited a long time for saying, of pauses that were doing as much work as the sentences. After perhaps 20 minutes, Holmes unfolded himself from his chair in one slow, fluid movement and went to his desk. He did not take out a case file or a notebook. He took out, instead, a small pipe, filled it with the last of his afternoon tobacco, a mild Virginia blend, not the stronger black shag he reached for when genuinely troubled, and settled into the chair at his desk at a different angle, one that happened to face the door. Watson watched him do all of this and said, "You're waiting. I am resting. You're facing the door. The door is in that direction. My facing it is coincidental. Your pipe is unlit." Holmes looked down at the pipe in his hand as though noticing this for the first time. He reached for a match. "Better?" Watson smiled and returned to not reading his newspaper. It was another quarter of an hour before they heard the movement begin again below. The door of Mrs. Hudson's parlour opened. They could both hear the particular creak of it, familiar from years of sound-mapping this old house, and footsteps moved through the back corridor toward the kitchen, which was Mrs. Hudson's route when she was fetching tea. A separate set of footsteps did not follow. The visitor, whoever she was, had remained in the parlour. Holmes stood. "I am going downstairs," he said, in the conversational tone of someone announcing they intended to look out the window. Watson folded his newspaper. "Then I am also going downstairs." Holmes gave him a brief, measuring look. "This is not a case." "No, but it is interesting." "I said it was interesting. I did not say it required two of us." "Mrs. Hudson made lardy cake. I have been patient about it for 3 hours. I am going downstairs." Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then he picked up his pipe and his own newspaper and said, "The lardy cake is incidental," in a tone that suggested he did not entirely believe this. They went downstairs. The kitchen was warm, much warmer than the sitting room above, filled with the concentrated heat of the range that Mrs. Hudson kept burning from 7 in the morning until she went to bed each night, a constant low furnace that was as much a part of 221B's character as the chemical smell in the back room or the stacks of papers in the hall. The lardy cake sat on the table on a wire rack, glazed and golden and still slightly warm. Beside it, a clean cloth and a small knife, because Mrs. Hudson believed in the dignity of proper presentation even for everyday baking. She was at the sink when they came in, and she turned quickly, and there was, Watson caught it, filed it away before it was gone, a very brief expression on her face that was not quite surprise and not quite discomfort, but something in between, a guardedness, a settling, as though she had quickly, invisibly rearranged herself before either of them could see what had been there before. "Gentlemen," she said, in her perfectly ordinary housekeeper's voice, "I was about to bring tea up." "We saved you the trip," Watson said pleasantly, and sat down at the kitchen table with the ease of long habit. Holmes remained standing near the doorway, in the posture he adopted when he was not being obviously observant, which was the posture in which he was most attentive. He looked at the lardy cake. He looked at the kitchen. He looked at Mrs. Hudson. "Your parlour door is closed," he said. It was not an accusation. It was barely even an observation. It was delivered in the mild, incidental tone of someone remarking on the weather. Mrs. Hudson set the kettle on the range. "I have a visitor." "A friend?" A small pause, not long, not dramatic, but present. "An acquaintance," she said, "from some years ago." Holmes nodded, apparently satisfied, and sat down. He set his newspaper on the table. He had no intention of reading it. Watson knew this. Holmes knew Watson knew this. Mrs. Hudson, experienced as she was, probably also knew this, but the form was being maintained, and so she sliced the lardy cake with her usual precise generosity and set plates in front of them both, and Watson said that it smelled wonderful, and she said it was an old recipe, and the kitchen went about the ordinary business of being a warm room on a rainy evening. But Watson watched her, and what Watson saw, not all at once, but in small accumulating glimpses across the next 10 minutes, was this. Mrs. Hudson was not entirely here. She was performing the kitchen in the way a person performs a familiar task when their attention is elsewhere. The tea was made with her usual care, but her eyes moved twice toward the corridor. She refilled the sugar bowl, though it did not need refilling. She straightened the cloth on the table, and then straightened it again. It was, Watson thought, the behavior of a woman whose attention was divided between two rooms, the room she was in, and the one she had left someone in. And the quality of that divided attention was not the mild social guilt of having left a guest momentarily unattended. It was something with more weight than that, something protective. Then the parlour door opened. She came into the kitchen corridor and paused at the threshold, and in the moment before she had registered that there were 2 additional people at the table, Watson saw her entirely unguarded, and what he saw in that second was tiredness. Not the ordinary tiredness of a long day, but the particular kind that lives in the muscles and the posture, and has been there long enough to have become, in some way, structural. She was a woman of perhaps 40, though she carried those 40 years in a way that suggested she had been asked to carry them quickly. Her dress was good quality, not fashionable, but well made and well cared for. Dark green wool with small covered buttons at the cuff. The kind of dress chosen for durability and respectability, rather than display. Her hair was neat, brown with early threads of grey at the temple, pinned with the efficiency of someone who does not have leisure to be particular about such things each morning. She wore gloves, not the thin summer gloves of social courtesy, nor the practical leather of someone who had walked here in the rain. These were heavier, dark brown, well fitted, and she wore them inside at a kitchen table in a warm house in October. The kind of October evening when any reasonable person would have removed their gloves at the door. Watson noticed. He did not look at Holmes. He did not need to. He could feel, in the particular quality of stillness beside him, that Holmes had noticed too. The woman's eyes moved quickly between Watson and Holmes, and settled, with some relief, on Mrs. Hudson. "I'm sorry," she said. "I thought I can come back another—" "No, no." Mrs. Hudson crossed to her with the particular swift decisiveness she deployed when she intended to head off a retreat. "These are my tenants, Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson. They were just going back upstairs." This was announced with the tone of a statement, but functioned, quite clearly, as an instruction. Holmes, to Watson's quiet surprise, stood, without any argument at all. He picked up his newspaper and his plate of lardy cake, nodded to the woman at the corridor. A brief, courteous nod, not the sharp, examining look Watson half expected, and moved toward the stairs. Watson followed. He did not look at the woman as he passed. He did manage to look at her hands. The left glove, at the wrist, had shifted slightly, in the way gloves shift when worn for a long time, rucked just a fraction, pulled slightly away from the cuff of her sleeve. In the gap between the glove's edge and the heavy wool of her cuff there was a very small thing, a dusting of white powder, fine as chalk, caught in the fold of fabric where the glove met the wrist. Flour. Not baking flour from an afternoon's work. Her hands had been gloved throughout. But the kind of flour that clings in a crease, because the crease is where she rests her wrists when she works. And she works with flour often enough that it has found its way into the deep weave of the fabric itself, the flour of someone who bakes every day, a professional kitchen, or a house where she serves in one. Watson filed it away and climbed the stairs. Upstairs, Holmes set his plate and newspaper on the sitting-room table and went directly to his chair. He sat. He looked at the ceiling. He pressed his fingertips together. Watson poured tea from the pot they had not finished and sat in his own chair. He cut a piece of lardy cake and ate it in the respectful silence it deserved, which was considerable. After a few minutes, Holmes said, "The gloves. Yes. She hasn't removed them since she arrived, not even in a warm kitchen. No." Another pause. The rain moved softly against the window. Down below, faintly, the sound of Mrs. Hudson's voice, low, unhurried, the tone of someone speaking with great care, saying something to a person who needed it to be said carefully. "The flour at the wrist," Holmes said. "Daily work. Baking for others. Not herself. The quantity. And distribution suggests a kitchen that produces in some volume." "A household kitchen," Watson said. "A larger one. Or a boarding house. Or a domestic post of some standing." Holmes's eyes moved across the ceiling in the way they did when he was organizing information. "She came here on foot. Her shoes, despite the weather, have the damp of someone who's walked a fair distance, not taken a cab. Either she could not afford a cab, or she did not wish to be seen taking one." Watson thought about this. "Or she didn't want anyone to know where she was going." Holmes said nothing, but he lowered his gaze from the ceiling and looked briefly at Watson, and in that brief look was the confirmation. "Yes, exactly that." "She's frightened," Watson said quietly. "Not frightened. Careful." Holmes reached for his violin and turned it over in his hands without playing it. However, there is a difference. Fear produces urgency. It makes a person move quickly or freeze entirely. Caution is fear that has learned patience. She has been careful for some time. Watson looked into the fire. A piece of coal settled quietly, throwing up a small, brief shower of orange sparks that faded before they reached the grate. The rain was steady now, a full, committed autumn rain, the kind that would still be falling at midnight and would leave the street smelling of wet stone and old leaves in the morning. She knew Mrs. Hudson, he said. Yes. Not recently? No. Mrs. Hudson was surprised, carefully surprised, the controlled surprise of someone who had been expecting this visit, in the way one expects something one has half dreaded and half hoped for. Not the surprise of a stranger, the surprise of someone for whom this face has a history. Watson nodded slowly. The fire crackled. Somewhere below, Mrs. Hudson's voice rose briefly, not in distress, but in the way voices rise when something true has been said aloud for the first time, and the room has had to make room for it. Then it settled. Warmth moved through the room. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked its patient inventory of moments. The lardy cake was excellent. Holmes set the violin down and picked up his chemistry text again, or appeared to, and Watson unfolded his newspaper one more time, and they sat together in the amber light of 221B's sitting room, while the rain spoke against the glass, and something, quietly, began to ask to be understood. The visitor left at 7:30. Watson knew this because he heard the front door, the soft, careful closing of it, the same quality of sound as the knock had been, considerate, unobtrusive, the action of someone who moves through the world with the constant low-level awareness of not wishing to be a disturbance. He heard Mrs. Hudson's footsteps in the hall, then the brief silence of the doorstep, then the footsteps returning inside, and the slower, more deliberate sound of the bolt being drawn across, not the hurried bolt of someone locking out the night, but the considered bolt of someone who, having sent another person out into it, wants to feel for a moment that she has done what she could. Holmes heard it too. He said nothing, but his fingers, which had been resting loosely on the chemistry text for the past half hour without turning a page, shifted very slightly. A small settling, as though a piece of information had arrived and been placed in its correct position. The fire had burned lower. Watson added coal from the scuttle, a satisfying domestic task, the lifting and the small cascade of black pieces and the immediate response of the flames finding new material and brightening. The room warmed again by several gentle degrees. Rain continued its conversation with the windows. The clock said 25 to 8. Holmes put down the chemistry text. "She works in a household," he said, in the conversational tone of someone continuing a discussion that had, technically, ended an hour ago. A substantial one, not aristocratic, but prosperous. The dress suggests she is not in service herself, or not in the lower grades of it. Too well kept. But the flower at the wrist, combined with the shoes, good leather, worn at the toe in the way that comes from standing on stone floors for long periods, suggests she spends considerable time in a working kitchen. Watson looked up from the fire. Housekeeper. Holmes turned this over. Possibly. Or cook. Or a woman who occupies one of those ambiguous domestic positions that don't fit neatly into the hierarchy. Someone who has been somewhere long enough to have authority in the kitchen, but no official title to it. He paused. The gloves. You keep returning to the gloves. Because they are the most interesting thing. Holmes rose and went to the window, standing beside it in the way he did when he wanted to think, without looking at anything in particular, the rain-blurred street below serving as a kind of unfocused backdrop to the focused workings of his mind. She wore them inside, in warmth, for the duration of her visit, which was, by the sound of it, at least 45 minutes. That is not comfort. That is concealment. Watson said nothing. The most obvious thing concealed by a glove, Holmes continued, is the hand itself, or some portion of it. A mark, old or recent, a bruise, a scar, something that, if seen, would prompt questions she is not prepared to answer, or has grown tired of answering, or has learned that answering only makes things more complicated. The fire crackled behind Watson. The room settled deeper into its evening warmth, and outside Baker Street went about its rainy business, the occasional cab, the distant sound of a vendor calling something unintelligible, the rhythmic drip of water from the building's eaves finding the iron grating below. "You think someone has hurt her?" Watson said. Not a question. Holmes turned from the window. He looked at Watson with an expression that was careful and considered and quite serious. "I think," he said, "that she is in a situation from which she is trying to find a way out, and that she has come to someone from her past, someone she trusts, which tells us she does not have many people she trusts presently, to ask for help in finding it." Watson looked into the fire for a long moment. And Mrs. Hudson? Holmes crossed back to his chair and sat, lacing his fingers together in his lap. "Mrs. Hudson," he said quietly, "knows more than she has told us, which is, of course, entirely her right." He paused. "She will tell us what she needs to tell us when she decides it is necessary. Until then, we observe, and we do not press." This was, Watson thought, spoken with unusual restraint, for a man whose relationship with not pressing was historically complicated. He said so. Holmes gave him a look of mild dignity. "I have restraint." "You have restraint, the way London has sunshine. It exists. One simply cannot rely on it." Holmes said nothing to this, which Watson took as a form of agreement. Dinner that evening was a quieter affair than usual. Mrs. Hudson brought up the tray at 8 o'clock. Cold beef, bread, mustard, a small dish of pickled walnuts, the particular combination she produced on evenings when she had been occupied with other things, and had not had time for anything more elaborate, but which she always presented with the same unhurried precision she brought to a full dinner service. She set things out with the measured movements of long habit, straightening the cloth, positioning the mustard pot so its handle faced Watson, who she had noticed over several years used his left hand for such things. Holmes watched her do all of this, not in the obvious way, not with the sharp, cataloguing attention he brought to strangers, which had the quality of being examined by a very precise instrument. This was different, more peripheral, more patient. The way you watch someone you know well, when you are concerned about them but have decided, for reasons of respect or affection, or both, not to say so directly. Mrs. Hudson finished arranging the tray and straightened up. She looked at the table, not at them. "There is lardy cake still," she said, "if you want it later." "Thank you," Watson said. "It was excellent." She nodded. She picked up the empty coal scuttle and tucked it under her arm with a small, satisfied nod toward the fireplace. Someone else had done the coaling, and this had been noted and approved. She was moving toward the door when Holmes said, pleasantly, "How long has it been since you last saw her?" A pause, very brief, but present. Mrs. Hudson turned. Her expression was composed. the particular composure of someone who has been keeping their own counsel for so long it has become a form of armor, worn so habitually they sometimes forget they are wearing it. "Some years," she said. "She's come quite a distance," Holmes said, lightly, conversationally, as though the observation carried no particular weight. "Yes," Mrs. Hudson said, "she has." Another small pause. Holmes reached for the bread and began cutting it with the same relaxed, incidental air, and Mrs. Hudson looked at him for a moment with an expression Watson could not entirely read, something between wariness and, beneath that, something quieter and perhaps more hopeful. The expression of someone testing whether a door they had always found closed might, on this particular evening, be slightly ajar. "She's not in trouble with the law," Mrs. Hudson said. It was offered carefully, but offered. "I assumed not," Holmes said. "She knocked like someone hoping not to be seen. People who are in trouble with the law knock like someone hoping not to be caught. The distinction is quite clear." Mrs. Hudson looked at him for another moment. Then something in her posture shifted. Very slightly, the small release of attention that had been held all evening. Not trust, exactly. Not yet. But the recognition that trust, in this room, was a possibility worth considering. "She needs help," Mrs. Hudson said. "A particular kind of help. That's all I can say for now." "That is sufficient for now," Holmes said, and returned to his bread with the serenity of a man who has asked his one question and is content to wait for the rest. Watson watched Mrs. Hudson's face, and in it, briefly and clearly, was relief. She left them to their dinner. Her footsteps down the stairs were different from how they had been all evening, not lighter exactly, but less armoured. The faint, barely audible quality of someone moving through their own house with slightly less weight than before. They ate in companionable quiet. The beef was good, the mustard sharp, the pickled walnuts the particular combination of sour and savoury that Watson had been fond of since childhood, and never quite managed to explain the appeal of to anyone who hadn't already discovered it, for themselves. The rain had gentled somewhat, shifting from its full, committed downpour to a soft, pervasive mist that caught the lamplight outside and turned Baker Street into something impressionistic. All blurred gold and grey movement, cabs appearing and disappearing like thoughts in a half-drowsy mind. Holmes ate sparingly, as he did on evenings when something occupied him, but he ate, which Watson had learned to take as a positive sign. Holmes, in the grip of a genuinely consuming case, often forgot to eat altogether, which Watson had long since given up trying to correct, and had instead routed around by leaving things within easy reach that could be consumed without requiring any conscious decision to do so. "The scar," Holmes said, midway through the meal. Not preamble, not context, simply the thought arriving and being spoken. Watson looked up. "The one under the glove. If it is a scar and not a bruise has urgency. It means something recent, something still, ongoing. A scar means something that has already happened, something she has had time to decide how to carry. But she still covers it." Holmes turned his bread over in his hands, which means either the scar is visible enough to prompt comment, or she has been covering it for so long that the habit of concealment has become its own answer to the question of why. Watson thought about the woman standing at the kitchen corridor, the tiredness in her posture, the particular quality of caution in her stillness. She's been in this situation for a while, he said. Yes. And she's come to Mrs. Hudson for help getting out of it. Yes. Watson cut a piece of beef and ate it thoughtfully. Then, he said, we should help. Holmes looked at him. There was, in his expression, something that was not surprise, but was adjacent to it. The particular look he wore when Watson said the thing he had already decided, but had not yet said aloud, as though Watson's saying it made it more official, more real. We should, Holmes said, when she is ready. And until then? Holmes reached for his tea. Outside, the mist rain moved softly against the glass, and the lamplight made patterns on the ceiling that shifted as the flame moved, slow and amber and quiet. Until then, Holmes said, we finish dinner. We do not speculate loudly, and we allow Mrs. Hudson the dignity of bringing this to us in her own time and in her own way. Watson raised his teacup slightly, a small, private toast to that, and Holmes touched his own cup to it with a brief, almost imperceptible acknowledgment, and they sat together in the warm room while the evening settled around them like something folded carefully and put away for safe-keeping. The morning after a rain is a particular kind of London morning, not the grey, undecided mornings of mid-autumn that arrive like an afterthought, but the clarified, washed kind, where the city has had its face cleaned overnight, and stands in the early light looking almost surprised at itself. The cobblestones of Baker Street held shallow mirrors of water in their uneven joints, each one catching a piece of pale sky. The railings were wet and dark. The air smelled of stone and leaves, and the particular cold cleanness that only exists for an hour or two, before the coal smoke reasserts itself and London returns to its usual aromatic complexity. Watson stepped out at 9:30. He had left Holmes at breakfast, or, more accurately, he had left Holmes at the breakfast table ignoring breakfast, which amounted to the same attendance with a different level of participation. Holmes had the morning papers spread across both his own plate and Watson's, and was reading them with the focused absorption of a man searching for something specific, though he had not said what. He had looked up when Watson put on his coat and said, "Marylebone first. Then, if you find yourself near Paddington, the registry offices on Praed Street keep records that are occasionally illuminating." Watson had paused, one button done. "I didn't say I was investigating anything." "No," Holmes agreed, returning to the papers. "You said you were going for a walk." A silence. "Praed Street," Watson said. "Third door from the corner. Ask for the Morning Ledger. Mrs. Fenwick is the clerk on Wednesdays, and she responds well to courtesy, and, if the situation warrants, the observation that her filing system is admirably organized." Watson had gone out into the morning. Marylebone in the late morning had the comfortable business of a neighbourhood that knows what it is, and has no particular ambitions to be otherwise. The market stalls along the side streets were already in full voice. A fishmonger arguing cheerfully with a woman about the relative merits of plaice and cod. A vegetable seller with a voice like a foghorn announcing the excellence of his parsnips to anyone within 50 yards who had not yet made parsnip-related decisions for the week. The smell of fresh bread came from a baker's whose door stood open despite the cold, and Watson slowed beside it with the helpless appreciation of a man who had already had breakfast, but whose nose was making a separate argument. He bought a roll. He ate it walking. This was not the behaviour of a man conducting a formal investigation, but it was the behaviour of a man who was thinking, and Watson did some of his best thinking while eating bread in the open air, which was a fact about himself he had never felt the need to examine too closely. What he was thinking about was the visitor. Not the facts Holmes had already assembled, the flower, the gloves, the shoes, the quality of her caution, but the texture of her. The way she had stood at the kitchen corridor threshold, and in that one unguarded second shown something very tired and very private. The way she had looked at Mrs. Hudson with the particular look of someone who has very few people in the world they would allow themselves to look at like that. The way she had said, when she saw Watson and Holmes at the table, "I can come back another," not finished the sentence, but the shape of it was, another time, another day, some other occasion when she might not have to manage the additional complexity of being seen. She was not, Watson thought, a woman in acute crisis. She was a woman in a long, managed, carefully sustained, difficult situation who had reached the point, which Watson, in his medical practice, had seen many times, where the management of it had simply become too exhausting to continue alone. This was, in some ways, harder than acute crisis. Acute crisis had urgency. People moved quickly, made decisions, reached for help. Long, quiet difficulty had its own gravity. It pulled inward, it accumulated, it made the idea of asking for help feel like an imposition, because the person had been managing for so long that they had convinced themselves and everyone around them that managing was simply what they did. Watson turned down a side street and walked toward Paddington. London, in October, away from the main thoroughfares, had a different character entirely. The grand streets, the Strand, Regent Street, the broad processional avenues of the West End, those were the London of performance, of display, of the city, presenting its most confident face to the world and to itself. But these streets, the ones between and behind, the residential terraces and boarding-house rows and quiet squares, where the trees had gone thoroughly amber and were beginning to let go, these were the London that actually lived in itself. The London of moderate means and careful budgeting and net curtains that were always clean. Of black iron boot scrapers beside every front door, used. Of window boxes still holding the last of the autumn colour, tended by someone who came out on cold mornings to do it because they believed in it. Watson passed a row of these terraces, 3 stories, well kept, a brass plate on one indicating a dressmaker, another with a sign for a respectable boarding house, weekly terms available, and thought about what Holmes had said. A substantial household, a working kitchen, a woman who baked daily and had authority in the kitchen without, perhaps, the formal title to it. There were hundreds of such households in London, thousands, large families with live-in domestic staff, boarding houses run by their proprietors, hotels, private clubs with kitchen arrangements, the prosperous merchant-class homes, where a household of 6 or 8 staff was unremarkable. The visitor could have come from any of them. But she had come from somewhere close enough to walk to, in weather like last night's, without it being remarkable. That narrowed it somewhat. And she had not taken a cab, which meant either she was frugal in the way of someone on a domestic wage, or she was careful in the way of someone who did not want a driver to remember. Her destination. Mrs. Fenwick at the Pride Street Registry Office was a small, precise woman of perhaps 55, who wore her hair in a style that had been fashionable in approximately 1871, and had apparently decided that the subsequent decades had not improved on it. She received Watson with the measured courtesy of someone who dealt professionally in information and had learned to assess, quickly, what kind of person was asking and what kind of answer would best serve everyone's interests. Watson was warm and direct. He explained, without quite explaining, that he was trying to trace a connection for a friend, a woman who might have been placed in domestic service in the Paddington or Marylebone area, perhaps 4 or 5 years ago, who had previously lived in this district. Mrs. Fenwick looked at him over her spectacles for a moment. Watson mentioned, quite genuinely, that her filing system appeared admirably organized. Something in Mrs. Fenwick's expression shifted by a degree or two toward cooperative. She turned to her ledger. The conversation that followed was useful, in the way that many small conversations are useful, not in producing a single, clarifying answer, but in producing several small pieces that did not on their own mean much, but were the kind of pieces from which, given the right arrangement, meaning could be assembled. He learned that in the relevant period, a number of women from this district had been placed in large household posts further into the city. A couple of Marylebone addresses, a Bayswater household of some standing, one placement with a merchant family near Gloucester Terrace. He learned that one of these women had come back some years later to quietly inquire about alternative positions, and had then, equally quietly, not followed through. He did not push. He thanked Mrs. Fenwick with the courtesy she had responded to. He stepped back out into Praed Street, where the cold air and the distant noise of Paddington Station, that perpetual, enormous iron and steam conversation, met him like a familiar acquaintance. He stood for a moment on the step, his breath visible in the cold air, thinking. Gloucester Terrace was not far. He did not go there. It was too direct, too visible, and in any case he had no authority to go there, and no natural reason to present himself at the door. But he walked the long way back toward Baker Street, which happened to take him along the edge of the neighbourhood in question, the handsome, slightly imposing terraces of the prosperous professional class, their front steps clean, their knockers polished, the kind of houses that presented a face of orderly prosperity to the street, and kept whatever was actually happening inside them behind their heavy front doors and their well-trained staff. He walked slowly. He did not see anything in particular. He was not sure what he had expected to see. But the walking itself was useful, the settling of things into their correct relative positions, the way physical movement allowed the mind to do its sorting. By the time he reached Baker Street and climbed the steps of 221B and was met by the warmth of the house, coal and tea and the faint ghost of last night's lardy cake, he had a shape in his mind that was not quite an answer, but was cleaner than what he had started with. Holmes was where Watson had left him, though the breakfast things had been cleared and replaced with the afternoon arrangement of books and papers and a fresh pot of tea that Mrs. Hudson must have brought up while Watson was out. The morning papers had been folded with a precision that suggested they had been thoroughly read and set aside. Holmes looked up as Watson came in. Watson sat down, poured tea, and said, without preamble, "Gloucester Terrace, I think, or somewhere very near it. A household of some substance. She's been there several years, but she inquired about leaving some time ago, and then didn't." Holmes said nothing for a moment. He looked at Watson with the careful, weighing attention he gave to information that confirmed what he had been building toward, then Slowly, he nodded. "Yes," he said, "that is also what I think." Watson drank his tea. The fire was good. The room was warm, and outside the afternoon was doing what October afternoons do, turning gold at the edges, the light going long and low and amber across the rooftops, the day beginning its early, inexorable slide toward evening. "She'll come back," Watson said. "Yes," Holmes said, "when she's ready." "And when she does." Holmes reached for his violin. This time he played. A slow, quiet thing, not a composition Watson recognized, but something that felt, in its movement, like a question being asked very gently of no one in particular. "When she does," Holmes said between phrases, "we listen." She came on Thursday evening. Not the visitor. Not yet. It was Mrs. Hudson who came at 8:30, after the dinner. Things had been cleared, and the sitting-room had settled into its late evening arrangement of lamplight and quiet. She knocked at the door of the sitting-room in the way she always knocked. Twice, with the knuckle of her index finger. A sound so familiar to Watson that he heard it, the way one hears a clock that has been in a room for years. Not as an intrusion, but as a natural punctuation of the evening. "Come in," Watson said. She came in. She was not carrying anything. No tray, no coal scuttle, no pretext of domestic purpose. This was, in itself, unusual enough that Watson set down his book, and Holmes, who had been lying on the settee with a monograph about tobacco ash balanced on his chest in a way that defied structural logic, swung his legs down and sat up. Mrs. Hudson stood in the middle of the room. She was a compact, self-possessed woman in her early 60s, and she had run 221B Baker Street with a combination of firm domestic authority and remarkable tolerance for the unusual that Watson had long since concluded was either saintliness or a very specific variety of iron-spined pragmatism. She had seen chemical experiments that turned the ceiling temporarily a different color. She had received, at various hours of the day and night, callers who ranged from distressed duchesses to men who appeared to have recently been on fire. She had once found a human ear in the butter dish, and her response had been to remove it, cover the butter, and come upstairs to inform Holmes with the measured, slightly weighted phrasing of someone who has decided that some things need to be said without editorial, but that the saying of them should leave no doubt about how they were received. She was not, in other words, a woman easily discomposed. But tonight, standing in the middle of the sitting-room without a tray or a pretext, she had the look of someone who has made a decision and arrived at the moment of acting on it, which is, Watson had observed, one of the more quietly courageous things a person can look like. "Her name is Clara," Mrs. Hudson said. "Clara Hemming. She was my neighbour. Before I came to Baker Street. Before any of this. We lived 2 streets apart in Camberwell for nearly 10 years. She paused. She was a good neighbour, the kind you don't always know you're grateful for until you no longer have them. Holmes said nothing. Watson said nothing. The room held the silence the way a good room does, not emptily, but with the quality of attentiveness, of space being made. She married, Mrs. Hudson continued, a man called Hemming. He had a prosperous business, dry goods, wholesale. The Gloucester Terrace house came with his position in it. It looked very well from the outside. She stopped, started again, more carefully. He is not a cruel man, in the way some men are cruel, not deliberately or with intention. He simply does not notice. He has never noticed that she is a person with needs that require attending to, and in 30 years of not noticing, he has done a great deal of damage without ever, I think, being entirely aware that he was doing anything at all. Watson looked at his hands. He had heard this kind of story before, in his practice, in the careful words of women who sat across from him in consulting rooms and chose, very precisely, which version of things to offer a stranger. The version that made it clear something was wrong without being more specific than they had decided to be. "She wants to leave," Holmes said. It was not a question. It was the quiet acknowledgement of something already understood, offered, so that Mrs. Hudson did not have to work her way toward it across more difficult ground. "She has wanted to leave for some years," Mrs. Hudson said. "But there are complications." She looked at Holmes directly now. "She has no money of her own. Everything is in his name, the house, the accounts. She worked in that kitchen for 30 years and has nothing she could carry out the door with her, and she—" A pause. "She is afraid of what he would do. Not violence. He's not a violent man. But the other kind. The kind that involves solicitors and consequences, and a woman finding herself without reference, and without standing, and without, frankly, any visible means of beginning again." Holmes had his fingers laced together. He was listening with the particular quality of attention he gave to things that mattered, not the sharp, acquisitive attention of the puzzle solver, but something deeper and more patient. "The glove," Watson said gently. Mrs. Hudson looked at him. Her composure held, but something behind it shifted, a faint, brief acknowledgement of the fact that they had seen what she had hoped they might not notice. "A burn," she said, "from the kitchen range, some years ago. It healed, but the scar, she finds it easier to cover it. People ask questions she doesn't wish to answer." She paused. "It was an accident. I want that. Understood. He was not responsible for it. But she covers it because it is one less thing to explain, and she has spent 30 years managing what requires explanation and what does not." The fire gave a quiet breath. Somewhere outside, a cab moved along Baker Street, and its sound faded gently into the damp evening air. Holmes unclasped his hands. He placed them on his knees and looked at Mrs. Hudson with an expression Watson had seen only a handful of times, stripped of the layered ironies and the performed disinterest, simply direct and clear, and, beneath that, something that could fairly be called kindness. "What does she need?" he said. Mrs. Hudson sat down. This was itself a small, significant thing. She very rarely sat in their sitting room, maintaining with gentle consistency the professional geography of her role in the house. But she sat now, in the chair Watson had quietly drawn slightly forward from the wall, and she folded her hands in her lap with the steady composure of someone who has rehearsed this part. "She needs 3 things," she said. "She needs somewhere to go, a position or a room in a respectable house, somewhere she can begin without having to explain herself in detail. She needs her name, her maiden name, Marsh, to be usable again, without the hemming attached to it in ways that would follow her. And she needs—" Mrs. Hudson paused, and here, for the first time, the composure showed its seam, the faint line where effort was being applied to hold it. "She needs someone to make certain that when she leaves, there is no legal mechanism he can use to compel her return, or to make her position so uncomfortable that coming back becomes preferable to staying gone. The room," was very quiet. Watson looked at Holmes. Holmes was looking at the fire. "The first," Holmes said after a moment, "is the simplest. There are several establishments I know of. Reputable, discreet, the kind that do not ask for references they cannot verify, provided the person arrives recommended by someone whose word they trust." He glanced at Watson. "You know Mrs. Fordham on Weymouth Street?" "I do," Watson said. "She has taken in several of my patients over the years. Quiet, clean, well run. She asks no questions she doesn't need the answers to." Holmes nodded. "The second, the name, is a matter of paperwork, and paperwork of that kind is, I suspect, within the particular competence of someone whose competence in such matters I have on several occasions been forced to rely on." He said this in the tone of a man who finds gratitude mildly uncomfortable, but acknowledges the debt. "Mycroft." Mrs. Hudson looked up. "My brother," Holmes said, "has access to, or can arrange access to, various administrative processes that are, technically, available to all citizens of this country, but which, in practice, require either a great deal of time or a great deal of knowing the right people. He has the latter in some abundance." He paused. "He will require a complete account of the situation. He will be discreet. He is discreet by professional formation. He finds indiscretion inefficient, which is as reliable a motivation for confidentiality as any moral scruple." Watson, who had met Mycroft Holmes on several occasions, and found him to be a man of vast intelligence, and very few words deployed in any direction that did not serve a precise purpose, thought this was an accurate and rather affectionate summary. "And the third?" Mrs. Hudson said. Holmes looked at her. "The third is Lestrade." A small flicker in her expression, not alarm, but the instinctive wariness of someone for whom policemen have historically represented not protection, but complication. Holmes read it immediately. "Not in any official capacity," he said. "Lestrade has, over the years, developed a particular understanding of the kind of situation you are describing, and the kind of informal conversation with a husband, conducted quietly and without documentation, that can sometimes achieve more than any legal mechanism. He is not subtle, but he is effective, and he is, when properly directed, genuinely on the side of the right outcome." Watson thought of Lestrade's large, honest, slightly harassed face, and felt the truth of this. The inspector was not a complicated man, but he was a decent one, and decency, directed with purpose, was frequently sufficient. Mrs. Hudson was quiet for a moment. She looked at the fire. She looked at her hands. "She'll be frightened," she said, "of all of it. She's been managing on her own for so long that help, being offered help, actual help, I think it may be the thing that's hardest for her to accept." "Then," Watson said, "you'll help her accept it. That is what she came to you for, not because you could solve it yourself, but because you are the person she trusts enough to stand beside her while it gets solved." Mrs. Hudson looked at him, and in her face Watson saw something he recognized from his years of medicine. The expression of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a long time on behalf of someone they love, and who has just, quietly, been told that they are not going to have to carry it alone any further. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you," in the precise, contained way of a woman for whom those two words represent a great deal more than their surface suggests. Holmes picked up his violin and turned it over once in his hands. "Tell her," he said, "to come Saturday. We will have everything arranged by then, or the arrangement of it well under way. She will not need to explain herself more than once." Mrs. Hudson stood. She smoothed her dress with one hand, the habitual gesture of a woman resuming her composure after having set it down, briefly, in a room where it was safe to do so. She moved toward the door. "Mrs. Hudson," Holmes said. She turned. She was fortunate, Holmes said, to have had you for a neighbour. Mrs. Hudson looked at him for a moment. Something crossed her face, warm and private, and not quite as composed as everything else, and then she nodded once and went downstairs. The fire settled. The lamp held its quiet gold. Outside, London moved through its evening in its usual patient, complicated way, keeping its secrets the way it always had, in the space between the lit windows and the dark street, between what was visible and what was, for those who lived it, simply life. Watson looked at Holmes. Holmes was already reaching for paper and pen. Holmes wrote 3 letters that night. Watson did not read them. It was not his habit to read Holmes's correspondence, and Holmes did not offer them for inspection, which was also not his habit. But Watson saw them produced, the first quickly, with the focused efficiency of someone setting down something already fully formed in the mind. The second more slowly, with 2 restarts, and the quiet sound of a pen being set down and picked up again, which suggested the phrasing required more care. The third, very briefly, barely half a page, sealed before Watson had registered it being folded. The first, Watson assumed, was to Lestrade. The second, from its length and the particular quality of Holmes's concentration, was to Mycroft. The third he could not account for and did not ask about. All 3 were sent with the first post on Friday morning. Holmes spent Friday in a state of composed waiting that looked, to the uninformed observer, like idleness. He read, he played the violin in long, unhurried passages. He conducted a small experiment involving iron compounds and rainwater collected from the window ledge that produced a satisfying result and a slightly less satisfying smell. Watson wrote letters of his own, visited a patient in Kensington, and returned to find Baker Street in the quiet, expectant state of a house that knows something is about to happen, and is holding its breath in an orderly fashion. Mrs. Hudson moved through the day with a quality Watson had not seen in her before, or not precisely this quality. She was not lighter, not obviously relieved. She was, rather, more present, more settled in herself. The guardedness that had been in her posture since Tuesday evening had not gone, but it had shifted in nature, from the guardedness of someone bearing something alone to the guardedness of someone bearing something alongside others, which is a different thing entirely. She baked again on Friday afternoon, not lardy cake this time, but a plain Victoria sponge, the kind produced for particular occasions, for people who were coming, for the marking of things that deserved to be marked with something warm and offered with 2 hands. Watson watched her carry it to the kitchen shelf and experienced the particular feeling of a house preparing itself. Lestrade arrived on Friday evening at 7 without his notebook. This was significant. Watson had known the inspector long enough to understand that Lestrade's notebook was not merely a professional implement. It was a form of psychological armor, the tangible representation of the official capacity in which he operated. When Lestrade arrived without it, He had made a decision, before he knocked, about what kind of visit this was going to be. He came upstairs in his usual manner, solid, purposeful, slightly damp about the shoulders from the evening mist, and accepted the chair Watson offered, and the tea that Mrs. Hudson had sent up with a timing that suggested she had been listening for the door, and looked between Watson and Holmes with the expression of a man who has received a letter he has read several times and has arrived with questions. "The situation," Lestrade said, "as I understand it from your letter, Mr. Holmes, is not a matter for the official record," Holmes said, "which is why I wrote to you personally at your home address and not to Scotland Yard." Lestrade absorbed this. He was a practical man, and the practical part of him had already processed the implications of a home address letter from Sherlock Holmes. "Right," he said. "So what is it a matter for?" "A conversation," Holmes said. "The kind that takes place between a man of some authority and standing." A small, precise pause that Lestrade received with a faint, involuntary straightening of his shoulders. "And another man, in a domestic context, who has perhaps not been clearly given to understand the weight of certain responsibilities." Watson watched Lestrade work through this. The inspector was not a man of great nuance, but he was a man of considerable experience, and experience had given him, over the years, a reasonably accurate map of the terrain Holmes was describing. "A husband," Lestrade said. "A husband," Holmes confirmed, "and the wife wishes to leave, safely, quietly, with her name intact and her future not encumbered by mechanisms designed to make her return inevitable." Lestrade was quiet for a moment. He drank his tea. He set the cup down with the careful placement of a man thinking. "This sort of thing," he said slowly, "is, technically, not a matter the police can involve themselves in, absent a specific complaint or—" "I know what it technically is," Holmes said. "I am asking what it practically can be. Those are, as you and I have established over the years, different questions." Another silence. The fire spoke quietly. Outside, the Friday evening version of Baker Street went about its business, a little more alive than weeknight evenings, a little more lamplight moving past the curtains, voices at a slightly higher register, the sense of a city that has reached the end of its working week and is allowing itself, marginally, to relax. Lestrade said, "I might, in an entirely unofficial capacity, pay a call on a man in Gloucester Terrace to discuss, in a general way, the various legal and social consequences that sometimes attend men of property and standing who find themselves on the wrong side of certain proceedings. Hypothetically." "Hypothetically," Holmes agreed. "And if such a man were to come away from that conversation with a clearer understanding of the advantages of a quiet, uncontested arrangement, then a quiet, uncontested arrangement would serve everyone's interests considerably better than the alternative." Lestrade looked at Holmes for a long moment. Then he looked at Watson in the way people sometimes looked at Watson when they wanted confirmation that the thing Holmes had just proposed was as reasonable as it sounded. Watson gave a small, affirmative nod. "Saturday morning," Lestrade said. "I'll be in Gloucester Terrace by 10. He finished his tea, declined a second cup with the regretful manner of a man who would have liked one but had somewhere to be, and went back down the stairs and out into the Friday evening, still without his notebook. Mrs. Hudson appeared from the kitchen corridor at the sound of the front door closing, looked up the stairs, and said nothing. But Watson, from the landing above, could see her face clearly, and what was on it was the specific, quiet relief of a woman watching the machinery of good people begin to move. Saturday brought Mycroft. He did not come to Baker Street. He never came to Baker Street, if he could avoid it, on the grounds that Baker Street required physical displacement from his chair at the Diogenes Club, which was a displacement he undertook only when the matter was either important enough or interesting enough to justify the expenditure. This matter apparently qualified on both counts. Instead, a note arrived at 9 in the morning, in Mycroft Holmes's handwriting, large, precise, slightly imperial. The handwriting of a man who writes as though fully aware that his letters may be read by posterity, and considers this reasonable. The note said, in its entirety, Diogenes, noon, come alone. I have spoken to the appropriate people. Bring the relevant particulars. Holmes read it, folded it, and said to Watson, "He means you specifically should not come." I gathered that. It is not personal. He finds the Diogenes Club more manageable in limited numbers. He finds everything more manageable in limited numbers. He finds the population of London excessive. Holmes put on his coat. That is not an entirely unreasonable position. He was back by 2:30, slightly rumpled from the cab ride, and carrying a small envelope, which he set on the mantelpiece with the care of something that contained more significance than its size suggested. He did not immediately explain its contents. He hung up his coat, sat down, accepted the tea Watson poured, and drank half of it before speaking. "Mycroft," he said, "has contacts within the relevant administrative offices, the process by which a married woman may re-establish the legal use of her maiden name is technically straightforward and practically laborious, which is why most women in Clara's position do not pursue it. Mycroft has, in the phrase he himself used with some satisfaction, streamlined certain procedural elements." Holmes's tone carried the specific quality of a man quoting language he finds both impressive and faintly alarming. "The documentation will be ready by Monday. The name Marsh will be, in all practical legal senses, fully operational." Watson looked at the envelope on the mantelpiece. "And the rest?" "Mycroft is also acquainted with the proprietors of 2 establishments in Edinburgh, and 1 in Bristol, who occasionally require persons of experience and discretion in domestic management roles. He has written, personally, not officially, on Clara's behalf. The nature of his personal recommendations is such that they are unlikely to require supporting documentation." Holmes paused. "He was, in his way, quite helpful. Did it cost you anything?" Holmes looked into his teacup. "He extracted a promise that I would attend his club dinner in December." Watson said nothing for a moment, experiencing the exact and specific sympathy of someone who has never been required to attend Mycroft Holmes's club dinner, but has heard enough about it to understand the sacrifice involved. "That was generous of you," Watson said. "Do not make it sentimental," Holmes said. But there was something in his expression, the very faint, controlled warmth that appeared there occasionally, always briefly, always on its way somewhere else, that made Watson think it had cost him rather less than he was pretending. By Saturday evening, the shape of it was clear. Lestrade had been to Gloucester Terrace that morning. He had not told them what was said, and Holmes had not asked. The inspector's methods were his own, and the results were what mattered. What mattered was that he had sent a brief note in the afternoon that said, only done. No difficulty anticipated. The brevity was, Watson thought, characteristic, but the certainty in it was the kind that came from a man who knew how to read a room and had read this one accurately. The documentation was being prepared. Mrs. Fordham on Weymouth Street had been written to by Watson on Friday, and had responded with the warm efficiency of a woman who has spent 30 years being quietly useful to people in exactly these circumstances, saying simply that a room would be available from Monday, that the weekly terms were reasonable, and that she looked forward to making Mrs. Marsh's acquaintance. Mrs. Marsh. Watson noticed when he wrote it. The name had a different quality to it than Hemming, lighter somehow. Returned to. The kind of name that had waited patiently for 30 years, and was now being picked up again and found to still fit. Holmes stood at the window in the early evening, looking out at Baker Street in the last of the October light, that long, amber, sideways light that made even the soot-stained cornices look briefly golden, that turned the wet cobblestones into something almost beautiful, that fell across the face of the city like a hand laid gently on something that had been through a great deal. "She comes tomorrow," Holmes said, not to Watson particularly, to the room, to the evening, to the small, completed mechanism of the thing. "Yes," Watson said, "she doesn't know yet." "No, Mrs. Hudson will tell her." Holmes nodded, slowly. The light held for another moment, that amber, patient light, and then began, as all October light does, to let go. The lamps below were lit, one by one, their gold replacing the fading gold of the sun with something steadier, more domestic, more enduring. Watson poured 2 glasses from the decanter on the side table. He handed one to Holmes, who received it without comment, but with the particular quality of quiet acknowledgment that, for Holmes, was frequently more expressive than words. They stood for a moment in the lamplight, the two of them, while London settled into its Saturday evening, and the machinery of several good people's effort moved quietly toward its completion. Clara Hemming came on Sunday afternoon. She came this time as someone who had been told to come, which is a different thing entirely from someone who arrives at a door hoping they will be allowed in. She had been told, "Come at 3 o'clock, come to the front door, come without apology." And she had done all 3 of these things, though Watson, watching from the sitting-room window as she came up Baker Street in the pale Sunday light, could see that the doing of them had required something of her. She walked with the careful, considered step of a person who has spent a long time moving through the world as quietly as possible, and who is in the process of learning, slowly, that quiet is a choice and not an obligation. Mrs. Hudson met her at the door. Watson did not watch that part. He stepped back from the window and returned to his chair, and Holmes, who had been at his desk with a pen, and had produced nothing for the past 20 minutes but a great deal of thoughtful stillness, set the pen down and folded his hands. They listened to the sounds below, not intrusively, not straining, but with the natural attentiveness of people in a house where something of significance is happening. Mrs. Hudson's voice, warm and unhurried. Clara's voice, quieter, but present. The sound of the parlour door, not closing fully this time, left slightly ajar in the way of a room that has decided it no longer needs to be sealed against the rest of the house. After perhaps 15 minutes, footsteps on the stairs. Mrs. Hudson knocked twice with her index finger knuckle and opened the door. Clara Marsh, and it was already, in Watson's mind, that name, the returned name, the one that fit, came into the sitting room of 221B Baker Street on a Sunday afternoon in October, and looked at it the way people sometimes look at rooms they have heard described but not yet seen. Not with wonder, exactly. With a kind of careful assessment, the look of a woman who has learned to read rooms, to understand what they mean about the people who inhabit them, to find in the arrangement of furniture and the quality of light some reliable indication of what she was walking into. What she saw was this: a fire burning at a good steady height, well tended, books in organized chaos on every surface, suggesting minds that used them rather than displayed them. A chemistry apparatus on the side table that had been, Watson noticed, discreetly moved to the less prominent end, where it would not alarm. 2 chairs positioned toward the fire with the ease of long use. A violin on its stand. A window with rain beginning softly against the glass. The same rain that had been present since Tuesday, persistent and gentle and apparently committed to keeping Baker Street company for the duration of October. It was, Watson thought, a room that looked exactly like what it was, a room where difficult things were brought and attended to with care. Clara looked at Holmes. Holmes looked at her. He rose, which was the formal thing, the correct thing, and said, "Mrs. Marsh, please sit down," in the tone he used when he intended a person to understand from the first word that they were safe here. She sat. She was wearing the same dress as before, the dark green wool, the covered buttons, but today she wore no gloves. Her hands rested in her lap, the left one turned slightly inward in the habitual, half-conscious gesture of someone accustomed to keeping that hand less visible. The scar was there, pale and faded at the inside of her left wrist, old, well-healed, smaller than Watson had imagined. The kind of scar that a person's eyes pass over unless they have been told to look. Holmes did not look at it. Watson did not look at it. They looked at her face, which was tired and careful and quietly hopeful in the way of someone who has been told good news, but has not yet fully allowed themselves to believe it. Mrs. Hudson sat beside her on the settee, close but not crowding, the posture of someone who is there, simply and completely there, which is sometimes the most useful thing a person can be. Holmes spoke quietly and directly, the way he spoke when he had discarded all the layers of performance and wit, and was simply being useful. He told her about Mrs. Fordham on Weymouth Street. The room, the terms, the nature of the house, the fact that Mrs. Fordham asked no questions she did not need the answers to. He told her about the documentation, that it would be ready Monday, that the name Marsh would be fully and legally hers to use. He told her, in the careful, measured language of a man who understood that this particular piece of information required the most careful delivery of all, that a conversation had taken place in Gloucester Terrace, and that no legal mechanism would be deployed to complicate her departure, and that the man she was leaving had been made clearly aware of the consequences of attempting otherwise. He did not tell her how any of this had been arranged. He did not list the names or the processes or the debts called in and the favours extended. He told her only the results, the clean, solid, reliable results, because results were what she needed, and the machinery that produced them was not her concern. She listened to all of it without speaking. When Holmes finished, the room was quiet for a moment. The good kind of quiet, the kind that follows something important being said, and needs a moment to settle before anything else can be added to it. Then Clara Marsh said, "I don't know how to thank you." It was said simply, without the elaborate courtesy of social performance. It was said as a true statement of a genuine condition. She did not know, had not yet worked out the grammar of. Receiving this, had spent so long in a life where help was not offered that she had not had occasion to develop a fluency in accepting it. Holmes said, "You don't need to." And then, with the briefest sideways glance at Watson that carried in it, compressed and efficient, the entirety of what he thought about gratitude and its expressions. "Watson will give you Mrs. Fordham's address. She expects you Monday morning, if that suits." Clara looked at Watson. He gave her Mrs. Fordham's card. He had written it out that morning, the address in his clearest hand, the name underlined because details mattered to people in new situations, and clarity was a form of kindness. She took it with both hands, the left hand and the right, together, without thinking about it. The card held between them, the scar visible and unremarked upon, simply part of a hand that was reaching for something. Watson looked away at the fire, because some moments are private, even when they happen in a room with other people. She stayed for tea. This had not been planned, or rather, it had been quietly arranged by Mrs. Hudson, in the way Mrs. Hudson arranged things that needed to happen without being officially proposed. The tray was simply there, appearing at 3:30 with the Victoria sponge that had been baked on Friday and had waited, patient and purposeful, on the kitchen shelf for precisely this occasion. They sat around the fire, the four of them, an unlikely and rather comfortable arrangement, and drank tea and ate sponge cake and talked about things that were not the situation. Mrs. Hudson and Clara talked about Camberwell, about people they had both known, about a particular greengrocer who had apparently been there 30 years ago, and was, astonishingly, still there, which provoked a brief, genuine laugh from Clara that transformed her face entirely, took the tiredness out of it for a moment, and showed something underneath that was warm and dry and unexpectedly quick. Holmes, for his part, was surprisingly easy company. This sometimes happened. On occasions when the formal performance of detection was over and the result had been a good one, he could slip into a quality of relaxed, straightforward pleasantness that his Baker Street reputation did not entirely prepare people for. He asked Clara about the kitchen at Gloucester Terrace with what appeared to be genuine culinary curiosity, and she answered with the authority of a woman who had spent 30 years becoming genuinely expert at something, and for a few minutes the conversation had the comfortable, specific texture of two people discovering an unexpected overlap of interest. Watson ate his sponge cake and felt the afternoon settle around him like something folded and placed with care. Outside, the rain continued its October work. The street below received it with its long patience. The gas lamps came on, one by one, as the light faded, their gold softer in the mist, diffused and gentle, turning the wet stones into something that caught the light without keeping it, held it briefly, and let it go. Clara left at 5. She stood in the hallway, with her coat buttoned, and her gloves, the same gloves, the concealing ones, in her hand, rather than on it, which was a small thing, and possibly unconscious. But Watson noticed it, and thought it was the right kind of small thing, the kind that suggests something interior shifting before the exterior has quite caught up. Mrs. Hudson walked her to the door. Watson and Holmes remained at the top of the stairs, not watching exactly, but present, in the way that good houses are present when something important is happening at their threshold. The door opened. The evening air came in briefly, cold and clean and smelling of rain. Clara Marsh stepped out into it, into Baker Street, into London, into the first evening of a different arrangement of her life, and turned once, briefly, at the bottom of the steps. She looked up at Mrs. Hudson. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be. The look contained what 30 years of neighbourliness, and then 30 years of absence, and then this 1 week of careful, steady effort had produced. Something that was not resolution, exactly. Resolution was too final a word for what life actually offered, but was the beginning of the next thing, the start of the part that came after. Mrs. Hudson raised one hand, briefly. Clara turned and walked up Baker Street, and the fog received her, gently, as London's fog receives everyone, without judgment, simply closing around her and carrying her forward into the evening. Mrs. Hudson closed the door. Upstairs, the sitting-room had found its late evening arrangement, without anyone having to do anything particular to arrange it. The fire had burned down slightly, and Watson had added coal without being aware of deciding to. Holmes was in his chair. His chair. The one with the worn armrest and the permanent ghost of Turkish tobacco, with his violin across his knees, not playing it yet, but turning it once, slowly, in the way he did when he was finishing a thought. The lamp cast its familiar gold across the familiar room. The rain moved against the familiar windows. Watson sat in his own chair and looked at the fire. After a while, Holmes began to play. It was not a composition Watson recognized, not one of the pieces he sometimes identified from Holmes's concert-going, not Bach or Mendelssohn, or any of the other names that appeared in Holmes's conversation with a frequency that suggested genuine love beneath the analytical appreciation. It was something quieter than those, something that felt less performed than thought, a slow, unhurried melody that moved through the room the way firelight moves, finding the corners, settling into the spaces between things. Watson closed his eyes. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked. The fire shifted, once with a small and comfortable sound. Somewhere below, Mrs. Hudson was moving through her kitchen. 3 steps, a pause, the kettle, the quiet and ordinary music of the house going about the business of the evening, the business of being a place where people lived and occasionally where people were helped, and sometimes where things that had been broken for a long time were, quietly and without ceremony, given back their right shape. The violin played on. Outside, Baker Street received the rain and the lamplight, and the Friday evening movement of cabs and coats and umbrellas, the whole complicated living surface of London going about itself in the way it always had and always would. Full of difficulty and warmth in equal measure, full of people managing things alone who did not have to, full of doors that could be knocked on, and fires that were burning, and rooms where the tea was always, eventually, made. Watson breathed. The music moved through the amber room like something that had always been there, waiting to be played, slow and warm, and entirely, quietly certain that everything was, for now, all right. And the rain fell, and the fire held, and 221B Baker Street settled into its evening, as it had done every evening for years, as it would do every evening for years to come, full of the particular, irreplaceable warmth of a place that knows what it is for. Breathe in, breathe out, sleep well.